In our last episode, we worked our way through Tier 6 on the complete video game console Iceberg, getting into some pretty rare and obscure consoles, but now it's time to go even further. In each episode, we'll get closer and closer to the bottom, so let's drop down to Tier 7, where we'll start getting into some very old and obscure consoles. I can almost guarantee there's at least 1 or 2 systems on this tier that you've never even heard of, and I hope you'll learn a little something from the video. It's starting to get very difficult to find old commercials and print media, but I'm determined to bring you at least a brief history of every single video game console ever made. So let's just get right into it and take a deep dive into Tier 7, starting with one of the very first home video game consoles ever made, the Coleco TelStar. The TelStar is a series of first-generation home video game consoles made by Coleco from 1976 to 1978. It is the predecessor to the popular ColecoVision game console, and the unit was based around the AY3-8500 chip, which was a Pong chip developed by General Instruments and later licensed for manufacturing by Magnavox, who at that time all console makers had to pay royalties to as the inventor of the home video game system. There were 14 different versions of the console released in the TelStar series. Each version came pre-packaged with an assortment of various games on it and had different controller styles depending on the games it had. So let's give some of these various consoles a brief rundown. The first version released in 1976 was simply called the TelStar. It had simple controls on the console consisting of 2 knobs that the user turned. It came with 3 games, which were hockey, handball, and tennis. A version called the TelStar Classic was released the same year and was internally the same but had a fancier wooden case instead of the original plastic model. A deluxe model was also released in Canada, again with the same internals but slightly different case and the option for French language. In 1977, the TelStar Ranger was released, which added 3 new games to the system on top of the original 3. These new games included High-Lie, Target, and Skeet. This version of the console also came with a light gun. That same year, the TelStar Alpha was released, which again had the same 3 original games but added Squash to the lineup. This model looked very similar to the Ranger, released the same year. Also released in 1977 was the TelStar Colormatic, which was the first version of the system to introduce color graphics. Although very basic, each game's graphics were a different color. This version of the console was also the first to introduce handheld controllers. The system came with 4 games installed that included hockey, handball, tennis, and High-Lie. At the end of 1977, Coleco released the most unique version of the TelStar, known as the TelStar Arcade. This version had the standard controls found in previous consoles, but also added a built-in racing wheel with a throttle, and a built-in light gun. This version of the system was also cartridge-based, and came with the games Tennis, Road Racing, and Quick Draw. The following year, in 1978, Coleco released another unique version of the TelStar called the Combat. This model was different in that it had 4 joysticks, 2 for each player. These joysticks were designed to work with the new games included in the system that included Combat, Night Battle, Robot Battle, and Camouflage Combat. Many other versions of the TelStar were released, but they were very similar to the ones we just talked about, so we won't go through all 14 of them. Over 1 million of just the first version of the Coleco TelStar consoles were sold worldwide. It was so successful with all of its variations that it's estimated that more than 1.5 million systems were sold in total during its short 2-year production. Moving on from the TelStar to another first-generation console released the same year, let's talk about the RCA Studio II. The RCA Studio II was released in January of 1977, a full 10 months before the TelStar. The graphics of Studio II games were black and white and resembled those of earlier Pong consoles and their clones. The Studio II also did not have joysticks or handheld game controllers, but instead used 2 10-button keypads that were built into the console itself. The system was capable of making simple beep sounds with slight variations in tone and length for game audio. The Studio II included 5 built-in games that included Bowling, Doodle, Addition, Freeway, and Patterns. The Studio II was not a successful console at all. The Fairchild Channel F that was released the year before made it obsolete before it was even launched, and the Atari 2600, which was superior to both of them, was released just 10 months later. After poor sales in 1977, RCA discontinued the Studio II the next year. After the disaster of the Studio II, RCA started to work on an updated version of the console called the RCA Studio III. But with the release of the Atari VCS, Bally Astrocade, and the upcoming Magnavox Odyssey 2, it was clear that RCA was about to release another inferior console than the competition. So RCA gave up on manufacturing the Studio III itself and licensed the technology to other companies for production. These variations of the Studio III include the Konica M1200, which was to be released in North America, the Mustang 9016 Telespiel computer released in Germany, the Trevi M1200 microcomputer released in Italy, the Academy Apollo 80 released in the United Kingdom, the Sheen M1200 microcomputer released in Australia, the Soundic Victory Home TV Programmer MPT-02 also in Australia, the Hanimex Zhu TV MPT-02 released in France, and the Toshiba Visicom C100 released in Japan. As expected, the Studio III did just as poorly as the Studio II, mostly due to the fact that the new console was almost identical internally to the previous version, but for the fact that it could play games in color. The graphics and gameplay were no match to other consoles releasing at this time from Atari and Magnavox. In total, there were less than 100,000 consoles sold worldwide of all variations, and most were discontinued within just a year or two. And that's the brief history of RCA in the home video game market. Keeping with the era of the late 1970s, we now move on to the Advanced Programmable Video System. The 1292 Advanced Programmable Video System is the second-generation video game console released by the European company Audiosonic in 1978. It is part of a group of software-compatible consoles which included the Intercon VC4000 and the Voltmace database. The system had a 0.887 MHz Signetics processor, 43 bytes of RAM, and used ROM cartridges for its games. The console was produced by different companies and sold with different names, but not every console is compatible with others due to differences in the shapes and dimensions of the cartridge slots. Some of these variations include the original Audiosonic 1292 Advanced Programmable Video System released in most of Europe, the Hanimex HMG 1392 Advanced Programmable Video System released in Australia and New Zealand, the Acetronic MPU 1000 available in the United Kingdom, the Voltmace database also available in the United Kingdom, Society Occitane Electronic OC2000 released exclusively in France, the ITMC Video Ordinateur MPT-05 also released in France, and the Grundig Superplay computer available only in Germany. Not much more information is known about the APVS, and it was discontinued in 1983 due to competition from more advanced video game consoles of the time. Okay, that's enough of these old video game consoles from the 1970s for now. Let's jump forward to the year 2000 to VM Labs' multimedia console, the Nuon. The Nuon is a 6th-generation 32-bit multimedia gaming system developed by VM Labs. It was released in 2000 at a price of $299 or about $500 today adjusted for inflation. The Nuon is essentially a DVD player capable of playing 3D games. You could also play audio CDs, and the system would generate visualizations in sync with the music. There were plans to provide internet access in the second generation of Nuon players, but they were never produced. The systems were made by 4 different companies. The 2 more common versions are the Samsung Nuon DVD player, released in America, Europe, and Korea, and the Toshiba Nuon DVD player, which was also released in North America and Asia. There was also a version made by RCA, as well as another made by Motorola, both of which are incredibly rare. All of them have generally the same internal specifications, including either a 54 MHz or 108 MHz Nuon processor, 32 MB of RAM, 24 KB of ROM, and a 64 MB internal drive with a 250 MB optional upgrade. Only 8 games were released for the Nuon, and some of the more popular titles were Tempest 3000, Space Invaders XL, Freefall 3050 AD, and Merlin Racing. The controller was a Logitech gamepad, and others were available such as the AirPlay wireless controller, a Pro Elite controller, and a few others. There were also 4 DVD releases utilizing Nuon technology, all of which were released by 20th Century Fox, and the Nuon offered the ability to fast forward, reverse, and zoom in and out more smoothly than a standard DVD player. The Nuon was very short-lived and was discontinued in 2004 with total sales numbers unknown. As the Nuon was leaving the market in 2004, a new type of video game console was arriving, a motion-based system known as the XavixPORT. The XavixPORT is a fitness-based home video game console developed by Japanese company SSD Limited and released in 2004 during the 6th generation of video game consoles. The XavixPORT was originally sold at a cost of $79.99 in the US, which is about $125 today adjusted for inflation. It was also released in Europe under the name Damios Interactive System. The XavixPORT was developed by 8 engineers who worked on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The processors were built into the games themselves, with the more basic games using the same 8-bit CPU that the NES had, and more advanced games were released using the 16-bit CPU that was in the Super Nintendo. The console uses cartridges and wireless controllers. The controllers are shaped like sports equipment, like baseball bats and tennis rackets, with the player's actions represented on the television screen through the use of sensors in the controllers, very similar to the yet released Wii. Many of the games released for the system came with specific controllers needed for the game to work, while others were sold separately. Many of the controllers were compatible with several games, and there were 23 games made in total, 10 of which were sold in the US, and even fewer available in Europe. The Nintendo Wii released 2 years later in 2006 and completely took over the market with a better library of games and better technology. In 2008, SSD ended production of the XavixPORT and sold the remaining stock for as low as $19.99. The XavixPORT was still available as late as 2012, but they were just selling old stock from their warehouse, and in 2003 the company ceased operations completely. Now moving on to a very rare console from the 1990s, only available in Europe, it's the Amstrad GX4000. The GX4000 is a video game console that was manufactured by the British electronics company Amstrad. It was released in 1990, only in Europe, at a price of £99 or about $275 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. There were close to 30 games produced for the GX4000, and the system came bundled with the game Burnin' Rubber and 2 controllers. Some more notable games were RoboCop 2, Pang, Navy SEALs, and Switchblade. The controller was similar to 8-bit gaming systems of the era and resembled those of the SNES and TurboGrafx-16, but with only directional pad and 2 face buttons. Initial reviews for the console before it was launched were good, saying it was a neat little system with potential, especially for its low price. But with the company only having a budget of £20 million for the console and its marketing, there were very few systems available when it was released, almost no advertising, and consumer interest in the console was quickly lost. With competition and heavy marketing from Sega, Nintendo, and PlayStation, the GX4000 was quickly forgotten. Within a few weeks of the initial launch, the system could be bought at discounted prices, and in just a few months some stores were selling it for as little as $29.99. Within 1 year of its release, Amstrad discontinued the GX4000 completely, having sold only 14,000 consoles, making it incredibly rare and hard to find today. Going back to the early 1980s, we move on to a console that actually started as a full-fledged home computer, the Tomy Tutor. The Tomy Tutor, originally sold in Japan as the Pyuta and in the UK as the Grandstand Tutor, is a home video game computer produced by the Japanese toy maker Tomy. The system was first released in Japan in 1982 at a cost of 60,000 yen, which is well over $1,300 today, converted and adjusted for inflation. It was then released in the UK and in the United States the following year. It was internally very similar but not identical to the Texas Instruments TI-99 home computer, and used a similar Texas Instruments 16-bit CPU. It had 16 kilobytes of RAM, 20 kilobytes of ROM, and a 256 by 192 resolution with 16 colors on screen. There were 26 games made for the Tomy Tutor, featuring a number of well-known titles, more notably Frogger, Scramble, Tron, and Bomberman. The console had 2 controllers that each had 2 buttons and a round pad for directional movements, and a keyboard was built into the system itself. Also in 1983, Tomy released the Tutor Jr., which was a trimmed-down console version of the original system. It had the same controllers, but removed the keyboard and replaced it with more simple buttons to handle basic functions. The Tutor Jr. was sold for half the cost of the original, priced at 30,000 yen. The following year, a new version called the Tutor Mark II was released, with essentially the same features as the original system, but with a mechanical keyboard to replace the chiclet-style keyboard. With the Mark II, the cost was reduced even further to just 20,000 yen. But even so, the Tutor failed to sell. One of the major reasons for the failure was not the system itself, but its marketing. The Tutor was marketed as a children's computer, stating that the machine would let an 8-year-old child use it without adult supervision, when in fact, it was practically a cheaper version of the TI-99 computer that any adult would have been happy to have. This, along with the release of the Nintendo Famicom and 6 other video game consoles within just a 2-month period in Japan, the whole line was discontinued in 1985, with about 140,000 units of both the computer and the console versions sold worldwide. Moving on from one computer/game console hybrid to another, it's the VTech CreatiVision. The CreatiVision is a hybrid computer and home video game console released by VTech in 1982 at a cost of $295, which is about $600 today adjusted for inflation. The CreatiVision had an 8-bit 2 MHz CPU, 1 kilobyte of RAM, and 16 kilobytes of video RAM with a 256 by 192 screen resolution in 16 colors. The console had 2 controllers that each had a keypad and joystick very similar to the ColecoVision and Atari 5200. It also has an I/O port for connecting a cassette player, keyboard, floppy drive, printers, and other peripherals. There were 18 games produced for the CreatiVision. Some of these titles included Chopper Rescue, Deep Sea Adventure, Sonic Invader, and Tank Attack. There were many different versions of the console made by different manufacturers depending on the market. Some of these models include the Japanese CreatiVision sold by Cherryco, the Educat 2002 sold in most of Eastern Europe, Italy, and South Africa, the Dick Smith Wizard sold in Australia and New Zealand, the Funvision video game system also sold in Australia and New Zealand, along with the Hanimex Ramses. There was a US release plan, but it was never realized. The system was not very successful due to strong competition and the fact that it wasn't a superior computer or a game system, and it was discontinued in 1985 after only 3 years of production. VTech gave up on the computer/game hybrid systems, but it did produce the Laser 2001 computer system in 1986 that was compatible with the CreatiVision games. And finishing up Tier 7, the last console on our list is the Epoch Super Cassette Vision. The Super Cassette Vision is a second-generation video game console made by Epoch and is the successor to the Cassette Vision, which we talked about on Tier 6. It was released in Japan in 1984 at a price of 15,000 yen, which is about $300 US today, converted and adjusted for inflation. It competed with Nintendo's Famicom system and the Sega SG-1000. The console is an 8-bit system with a 4 MHz CPU, 128 bytes of RAM, 4 kilobytes of ROM, and a 309 by 246 screen resolution in 16 colors. It came with 2 controllers that were hardwired into the console, each having just 2 action buttons and a single joystick for movement. The controllers were stored under a lid on the front of the console. There were a total of 30 games produced for the system. Some of the more popular titles include Professional Wrestling, Pole Position 2, Boulder Dash, and Dragon Slayer. Later in 1984, the console was released in France under the name Yeno Super Cassette Vision. And in 1985, Epoch released an all-pink version of the console in Japan targeted at women called the Super Lady Cassette Vision that came in a fancy case and with a higher price of 20,000 yen. But by 1986, it was clear that Epoch just couldn't compete with Nintendo and Sega, and the company decided to cease production of the console. About 300,000 units were sold in total during its 4-year lifespan, and the Super Cassette Vision would be the last video game console Epoch would ever produce. And that's it for Tier 7 of the complete video game console iceberg. If you made it this far, I really do appreciate it, and if you took a second to click the like button, that would be amazing. Let me know in the comments if you or anyone you know had any of these very obscure consoles, or if you had the opportunity to play any of them. We're starting to get into some very, very rare consoles now, and there will be even more in the next episode. I have a lot in store for the channel, and I upload new videos every single week, so be sure to subscribe if you want to get notified of new iceberg videos. I also have a poll on my channel in the community tab, so you can help me choose the iceberg series I do next, so be sure to check that out and vote which iceberg topic you want to see in the next series after I'm done with this one. I'll do that with every single iceberg video series I make, so you the viewer will determine what videos I make next. You can follow me on all social media platforms at IcebergDocs if you want to stay updated and connect with me. And if you want to help support the channel, you can do that too by becoming a Patreon, where you'll get early access to all my documentaries before they get to YouTube. Links in the description. Again, I thank each and every one of you for your support and for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.